Osrith soon detected her brother. He was the lounging warrior. Before him was a woman with her son, and in the midday brilliance Osrith could make out that it was Elfberg, the two cranes employee, deep in conversation with the warrior her brother called Cedric. And now a man was approaching, one who seemed to be a monk, dressed in a rough woolen robe tied with a rope, his pale hair around his head. He seemed to be in deep conversation with Uhtred, who was now standing up, and seemed to be insisting the monk leave them. But the man was insistent, gesticulating to Uhtred, and then to himself, and then to the palace. Uhtred kept trying to still him by waving his arm towards him, but at last the monk got his way and was allowed to approach them, and they continued the conversation in the space between them. That was them all, Osrith thought, as she looked across to her brother again. All of his men were there, and Stipa had come behind them and was addressing Uhtred. She made to get up too. She had probably been away long enough from the hall, but she had not counted correctly, for, when she got to her feet, Osrith felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned quickly, but not quick enough to raise Bué, and her brother's Irishman put a finger to his lips, shushing her. "I know you followed us that time Cedric was after you," the Irishman was saying, as Osrith glowered, hand halfway to Bué. "Why, you sang a new Aineel song." "So did I. So I'll ask you again, why?" Osrith relaxed a little, and instead of withdrawing her blade, folded her arms in front of her. "I heard a tongue I recognized," she said, hoping it sounded genuine. Finan's face flickered with recognition, but did not move away. "You are a long way from home," Osrith replied, her hand this time reaching down for tagged Seeks. "As are you, Gaelish woman," Finan offered. "Benan Gaelish." Osrith nodded her head slowly, but did not correct him. "And you?" Osrith asked, looking into his pale blue eyes. She had seen eyes like those before. "Are you a Varian?" "I was," Finan replied, not moving out of her immediate vicinity. "And you?" "I am Lackland, once in service to a king in Albert." Finan's eyes narrowed, thoughtfully. "Who died, and whose throne was taken by Oadan Grioghair?" How strange it all sounded, like a story from another life, like a veil pulled down between Wessex and Alba, which she had sailed through with Alf and Gert. "My lord died, so I turned mercenary." It was as true as Osrith was ever likely to admit. "So you followed us because of my beautiful voice?" Finan postured, disbelievingly. "I did." She glanced over to Uhtred. Finan followed the path of her gaze, before she pulled it away and back to him. "You have a soft position here," Finan proposed, smiling a broad smile. "Guarding the Etheling." "I have known worse, it is true," Osrith agreed. "And you fought the prince well yesterday." Osrith felt her heart glow, but she fought to maintain dignity. "Tapardleet, Moth I Hearna." At her words of thanks, addressing him as a lord, Finan threw back his head and laughed. "Chanil Meath I Hearna, Thaith I Hearna." He pointed to Uhtred. Then, he inclined his head towards Osrith. "Seer, I saw Ethelwold speaking to you earlier." "Yes," Osrith replied, curtly. She had felt unnerved by Ethelwold, but here, in the bright light of a high summer's day, with people going about their business, her fear seemed much diluted. "Thamidillich." Finan was sorry, he said. "Well, you cannot help his behavior, can you?" Osrith looked into his eyes. Osrith had never met him, of that she was sure. Yet, Finan's face looked familiar. "I could murder him," the little stirred, he replied, but broke off, and nodded to his lord as Uhtred approached them, with the warrior, Cedric, who had chased her over the matter of her speaking to Elfberg. Cedric looked abashed, and when he turned to try to protest something to Uhtred, her brother shook his shoulder and gestured in Osrith's direction. "He has something to say to you," Uhtred announced, as Cedric looked remorsefully at Osrith. Osrith looked back at him, waiting. It took 2 deep sighs, and a glare from Uhtred for the warrior to speak. "I am sorry for our disagreement," he said, baldly. Osrith felt a smile flicker at her mouth, at the absurdity of the situation. Clearly, he must now know that she was a woman, and unlikely to be a rival. Uhtred shook his shoulder, and Cedric shuffled his feet. "But," Osrith replied before the young man could expand, "I think Elfberg saw something there is not between us." Cedric nodded his dark head, glaring at her. but said nothing. "She is a very beautiful woman." "Yes," he agreed, then picked up his head, defiantly, "and I intend to be married to her," he shot back. Osrith bowed her head in acknowledgement. Clearly it had taken a bit of courage to approach her over matter of the heart, courage, and the will of his lord. Osrith could have teased him about it, but frankly, she was relieved. Elfber would hopefully have a home now, and wouldn't have to whore, and Osrith would be able to go to the Two Cranes for a drink unmolested. So, that is an end to it. Uhtred looked to Osrith, who nodded, and she watched her brother turn, hand still on Sitric's arm as the young warrior looked back over his shoulder, giving Osrith a frown. "So, that's sorted out, then." Osrith looked up to Finan, who grinned, and began to follow them. Then, he turned to Shirei and Drasta. "Shirei," Osrith called back, glancing back to the palace. They were going inside, and she watched them step through the gates. Making to go too, she looked in their direction again and caught Finan looking across at her once more. 88,888,888 wine is needed. "Are you not the one to bring it?" Ethelred's voice called to her across the hall. Wine had indeed been drunk, and she located Elfgar, and decided to stick with him for the rest of the night. "A walk," was Osrith's reply when he'd asked where she'd been, and concern had crossed his features for a moment. From one of the tables near the doors to the kitchen a flagon, freshly filled, stood waiting to be poured. "Indeed," Osrith replied, pacing over to the wine. "Wine will come when we are ready, Ethelred," Uhtred shouted across to him. Room had been made for Uhtred, and his warriors had been found benches. When she brought it, Osrith caught him glaring at the Lord of Mercia as she poured it. "I was impressed by how you handled Edward," her brother said to her, as she retreated. "Thank you." That was praise enough. To be praised by a lord before other lords. It did not touch her as it should, though. He was her brother, and Osrith wondered now as she had wondered earlier that day that she did not feel the surge of happiness she thought she would feel when her brother spoke to her, nor even when praising her for her warrior skill. She caught Finan's eye as she turned, and returned to guard duty near the door. "He hates him," Elfrith hissed, as Uhtred turned on Alfred's new son-in-law. "He is his cousin." His aunt married the Lord Uhtred's father, moving to God knows where, up in the north. "Interesting," Osrith murmured, as her mind raced. This, she didn't know not of their father's first wife, which made Uhtred part Mercian, as she, Osrith, was part British, of Cumbraland. An hour went by, as Elfrith regaled her with different alliances and feuds amongst the lords, until night began to chase the day into the western sky, a line of orange-red underlining the horizon in its vividity. "You need to go on duty at the gates," Miriel told her, tapping her on the shoulder. "Godwin and Hald are there, and they need watching. One of them is bound to try to go to sleep." He lowered his head to Osrith's ear. "If they aren't trained when the Lord Odo is ready to leave, well, they just better be." Osrith felt herself nodding. It would be shameful of them all. If they were asleep, a bucket of cold water would be the least of their worries. If Miriel found out guard-up duty for the next fortnight would clear their minds. Yet, the darkness brought a chill to her body that was nothing to do with the soft dusk air. "I am not with the Etheling," she willed. Her eye drifted over to Edward, who was busy engaged in a discussion with one of the Mercian lords. "Steep is to guard him for the moment. Some of the Wessex guards are sick and we are covering more than one duty. So to it. Up the ladders." He took a glance contemptuously at the flagon being replaced by one of the maids on the table beside her. "No more bloody wine pouring. It is demeaning for a soldier." "Sick," Osrith whispered to herself as she got outside. That was a new name for it. Out celebrating promotions or redesignations to other armies. Consoling one another for being passed over for promotion. Contrary to Miriel's expectations, Hayard was one end of the parapet overlooking Winchester's city square, chatting quietly to Godwin, who was at the other. Perhaps they were pleased they were being trusted to be going to Devonshire with the Lord Odo. It was a cushy role. After all, little happened in the country, and when it did, it happened in a slow and sedate manner. If they were unlucky, They might be posted with guard to the northern coast to guard from raiders, or to the very south to liaise with traders from Cornwall, their neighbouring kingdom, though it was meant to be part of Wessex now, or from Francia, bringing wine and cloth, to sell for copper, tin, wool and stone. "What's in the bucket, Osrith?" asked Hayard, when he saw the bucket in her hand. Osrith grinned. "To wake up guards asleep on duty," she retorted. "Who would blame us?" Godwin answered back, cheekily. "Anyone who might attack Winchester are in there, drinking." "Are you telling me there are Northmen in the palace?" Osrith was enjoying herself. The look of confusion passed over Godwin's young face for a moment, and then he looked terrified as she bore down on him. "Are you telling me you are derelict in your duty, Godwin, that you have allowed enemies of the king into palace? Who would creep up on the palace tonight?" Hayard answered back, hands on his hips. "On an important night like tonight?" he yelped when he got soaked in the cold well water that Osrith had brought with her. "A king was anointed the night I jumped from a parapet not much higher than this one." Osrith growled back, bearing down on him. "The king, anointed, and his so-called allies, creeping up to the monastery. Doesn't sound very likely." Godwin was in the mood to try to out-argue Osrith and back up his friend by sneering at her, but found himself pinned up against the wooden bars of the railings by Osrith's right arm, her left hand raised to thump him. "Doubt me, do you?" she snarled in his face. "I jumped, my best friend jumped." Her heart beat hard as she remembered Tag taking on two of them. "We disarmed them." "Oh yeah, and that's why Hayard ended up with the punch that had been intended for Godwin." "You haven't lived, little pups," she shouted. "You!" Osrith backed away from Godwin as she hauled Hayard to his feet. "Those allies did indeed turn out to be enemies. No honest person creeps up to their friend's celebration." So, she pushed him towards the railings, nearly making him topple over. "Stay there, and you," she hauled Godwin to the other end. "There. Now, until you are relieved, don't answer me back, or I will personally ask to replace you in the Lord Odder's guard." "I could do the work of both of you and still have time to spare." Osrith waited as Venus butted across the evening sky, as the moon rose and at two sullen, but chastened young guards, who were standing, statue-like and staring down into the darkened streets. They had no idea, down here, none. No clue of life other than a soft life. Where her heart soared with the sigh-inhabited lands in Alba and Irian, there was nothing here, just chalk softened water and fertile soils. Even the Britons hadn't put up much of a fight, it seemed, when the West Saxons had settled here. At least Henogled had challenged, and had kept on challenging Bernicia and Dirria, settled as they had been by the Saxons of Lincolnshire, her ancestor, Ida, having beat a path north for land, for whatever reason, which was why her namesake had sent to be no buried her uncle, St. Oswald, at Bardney. Leofstan, a guard under Steeper, came to relieve her as the night grew heavier, and she descended the steps to the courtyard, leaving the two young guards, silent and fixed, for him to deal with. The celebrations were continuing in the hall, and she headed to it. Food was still being sent, and as she drew nearer, she could see many of the guests still drinking and eating. Was Edward still there? Surely he had gone to his bed by now? But she never got as far as the door to find out. Ethelwold, who had watched her progress from the ramparts, took her by the shoulder. "Ah, their warrior witch," he slurred, as he backed her into one of the hall's hard walls. If he hadn't been drunk before, the king's nephew had certainly made up for it now. "Continue to say it, Lord Ethelwold, and you may not wake up." Osrith, who had been growing resentful as she had brought to mind Alba, was in no mood to be equanimitable. "Are you not supposed to be with my cousin?" He pushed her back harder, gripping her right hand, so that she could not reach for Buet. "Ethelfled, hasn't she gone to her bed by now?" She was provoking him, and at that moment, Osrith didn't care. "The little whelp of a shit who Alfred is raising to be the next king, to take my place." His breath stank and Osrith tried to turn away, but Ethelwold forced her chin back to his own leering face. Osrith was expecting the press of his body and was ready to knee him in the balls, but a lightness came to his body and he was hauled away. "Ethelwold, he is just trying to do her job. All right, there's a good fella. Behind him, Finan had both hands on the nobleman's shoulders. But Ethelwald wasn't finished yet. So you agree she is a woman, Irishman? Finan turned to Osrith. Do you want me to knock him out for a year? He asked, squeezing Ethelwald's shoulders, and the man winced in pain. Not tonight, Osrith replied, glaring back at Ethelwald, holding her head back to the wall. As she relaxed her neck muscles, her next move was to have been head-butting Ethelwald in the nose. No one wouldn't have believed he hadn't fallen, the state he was in. Instead, Ethelwald leered at Osrith and was promptly sick all down himself and over the flagstones. Osrith stepped to one side. Morantain, Osrith said, as Ethelwald stalked away. Finan nodded his head at her and turned. SC Urbetha, he replied. Calig SC Urbetha 88,888,888. A fortnight later, Ethelf had gone from the palace with Ethelred and the mercenaries with just a small household guard under Aldhelm, Lord Ethelred's most trusted advisor, and Osrith realized she was coming to value her teaching Edward the Etheling. She would wake at dawn from her place beside his door and wait until he was awake, escort him to Brewakfast and then go out to the training ground beside the hall to begin their sword skill. He was certainly improving, and Osrith could glimpse a figure every so often at the window, which she guessed was his father overseeing his progress. However, that morning their training was interrupted by Steeper, and Edward was brought away. You may take the afternoon off, Steeper told her. The Etheling is to be with his father in the scriptorium until sunset. Osrith was grateful for that. It was just after harvest and the weather had turned sultry. She needed to bathe, and had, on her walks around Winchester on nights she couldn't sleep, had identified a secluded place upstream near where she had once camped sharing the she-wolf's shelter. After noting she needed more lily root to brew to prevent her bleeding, she nodded to Godwin, who had, once again, been given a privileged position above the ramparts of the palace, one which, this time, he was relishing by flirting with any young women who were passing by. Osrith shouted up to him that, if he wanted to be remembered as the guard who let in Danes for want of watching properly, he should carry on. Probably doesn't mean you, Lord, Finan said, with a chuckle, as Utad and his men passed across the street. That's because I'm a Saxon, born. Utad snapped back. He was irritable, because he was going to have to leave Gisela again, as there were reports of the Norse Thurgilson brothers in London and Alfred would be calling on him to go there to prevent their takeover. He nodded, however, at Osferth, who now, with Osrith still in sight, turned on his heel and began to follow her. He did not, however, expect to be following her as she doubled back on her way to the river, heading north, and finding herself in Crapelgate, nor did he expect Osrith to be behind him as she slipped into the Briton ghetto, and Osrith froze when he found a knife at his throat. A Sikh's, if he had cared to notice. Osrith had learned from the last time what the tread on a stone or the creak of a plank might mean, and she had drawn tagged Sikhs silently, and Utad's youngest Oathman was trembling under its blade. Osrith noticed with satisfaction that he looked terrified. Tell me why you were following me, and I may let you live. May, Osrith emphasized, making sure the blade was touching the skin on his neck. My lord sent me, Osferth quavered, looking across to her. Then as down to the straw-strewn street as he could manage with his head forced upwards. Your lord. She thought back to the feast, and remembered how he had knelt before her brother on the steps outside the palace. Utad. Osferth nodded, carefully. Osferth nodded, a gesture which was halted when the blade pricked his skin. You? Are you not a monk? I was a novice, now am I a warrior. You don't look like a warrior to me. She stepped away and looked at his form, and down towards his back. Nor a monk. Where's your hair? Osferth's hair was short with a bald patch at the back, not bald all over with hair falling down to his waist. Your hair is wrong, your robes are not colored. We wear whatever we can find, whatever poor cloth the church has. Osferth sounded more nervous about his appearance than the threat to his life. And, oh, you mean the Irish church? He exclaimed, raising a hand to his head. No. We are the one true church, the Roman Church. The Irish Church is the Roman Church, Osrith bit back, affronted. "And are you still the son of the king? Is Ethelwald trying to kill you, too?" Osferth gave her a crooked grin. "I don't think so." "So, why is Uhtred trying to find out where I go?" "I don't know," Osferth lied. Osrith knew it, too. "If it's because I'm a woman, I am in no way interested," Osrith said, resheathing tagged Sikhs. "He is happily married. I think," Osferth protested, looking uncomfortable at where the line of conversation was going. He looked it, Osrith thought, ignoring Osferth's amazement at her sex. "At the palace, at the wedding. He may also know about the silver and catch me using it, or stealing it from somewhere else," Osrith added, in her mind. "I am glad I used only 2 silver coins, that would be explainable." Though, if he were to press her, she would have to admit she had come twice, and had more than 2 silver coins in her possession. She drew back tagged Sikhs and it rang with cleanliness as it slipped into its fleece-lined scabbard. "What?" she snapped, suddenly, when she realized Osferth was gaping at her. "You are a woman?" he asked, amazed. Is that what he wanted to know? Is that what the Lord Uhtred wanted to know? "Because I am almost certain he knows me." Osferth clambered up and took a step back from her, nearly tripping over a young British child who was playing with a stick. "I don't know to see where you went, I think. What are you going to tell him?" "I didn't see you," Osferth stammered. Osrith put her hands on her hips. "We both know that's a lie. He wouldn't have had me followed otherwise, and he will know." Osferth managed. The Sikhs had appeared again in her hand. Then she let go. What had he wanted to join her brother for, anyway? He didn't look much like a warrior. He had a sword but made no attempt to use it. Was this mission a way of testing him? "What's your name?" Osrith asked. "Be Brother Osferth," he stammered. "Warrior Osferth, now, really? And, is the king really your father?" Warrior Osferth nodded. "Tell me why you wanted to be a warrior, with the Lord Uhtred," Osrith demanded, her voice sharp and loud. "Why him?" "Because," Osferth replied, not looking at her, "my uncle, Leofric, was his dearest friend. My mother sent me to a monastery because the king commanded it. And now my brother is trying to rile the king for his own amusement by taking you on and trying to make you into a warrior, the most unlikely candidate for warriorship in the history of the world." Even Indra had tried to wield a sword at the Battle of Doir and had caused damage to a good few Norse before his demise. Osrith's heart softened a little. "And you will tell Uhtred? What of me?" Osferth just stared at her, shaking his head slightly but did not reply. Good move, Osrith thought. For he probably watched me fighting, and would know I could discover whatever he would tell Uhtred. And if he told her he would be saying nothing, Osferth knew she would discover if he had not. Osrith took a step towards Osferth, and he flinched. She made an attempt to smile. What was, she hoped, a reassuring smile. "Tell him the truth. Say I went to the Britons for medicine." Osrith corrected his story. "I fought you, I got away." Osferth nodded in agreement, and flinched as Osrith withdrew Bué. He took up his own sword as she nodded to him. "Hold your sword closer to you and swing from your shoulder," she counseled. "You will find it easier." He swung it, and Osrith nodded, before striking her own sword at his. Osferth cringed, and remained crunched up even when Osrith put Bué away. "The Lord Uhtred will not believe your sword was used unless you have a mark or 2 on it," she advised. "Look, Bué is away." "Bué?" As he slowly put his own sword back in its scabbard, he repeated the name of hers. "It means victory. I was asked to name it before a king. I won it, in a fight." Osrith glanced down, admiringly at the weapon. "It is a good name. She has not betrayed me yet." "Good day to you, lady," Osferth said, dipping his head as if Osrith really was a lady. A couple of older British children laughed. "Warrior," she corrected. "I am no lady, believe me." Osferth nodded again, and then he turned and strode away, towards the river. Osrith's hand patted Bué's scabbard, and then she climbed up onto the nearest part of the wall, and watched him pass down towards the river, then turn west and head towards the city. At least that part was true, Osrith thought, and then she clambered down again and went in search of the British healer. Allah had the lily root and she imbibed a steeping of it there and then. It tasted different compared to that prepared by poor Barkin Dunnottar. It would reduce her monthly blood to practically nothing, and reduce the burden in her bag brought with her and still hidden in the stables by 3 silver coins. Even to improve her sword had not cost that much. But the Britons risked a great deal to bring medicines to the Saxons, and they, in turn, chose to ignore the Britons' existence. More silver was offered, and taken, for more next month, and Osrith, too, was soon beyond Crapelgate and back down to the streets to Winchester's city centre. And who should be walking the other way, with a boy and girl in hand, but her sister-in-law. 88,888,888. While her desire to make herself known to her brother had ebbed to practically nothing, Osrith's interest in Gisela was keen. On the occasions she had taken Utard's silver, she had lingered to watch for a few moments and had been rewarded with the intimate picture of her brother's life, that with his wife, on whom he clearly loved, even after 2 children, and his son and his daughter, her niece and nephew, Osrith told herself. And, as he had had a brief conversation to Finan on one of those nights when she had been where usually cats and dogs slept, it was clear that, first of all, Bibbenberg was his clear motive, and second, that his children were treasured by their father. On one of her aerial eavesdropping evenings, she watched as both Utard, his firstborn, and the little girl Chiora, came out to meet him. He had said nothing to them for a good long time, then swept his daughter up into his arms, depositing her onto his shoulders in that time-honored father-child position, then wrapped his arm around his son. Chiora had come out with what looked like a bundle of cloth on a second occasion, and Utard had stared at it intently, before both of them breaking into laughter, his daughter's little, high-pitched tinkling blending with his own mirth at whatever it was that was funny. As she headed back to the palace, to see if she was still needed that day, or if she could take more leave, to bathe in the Itchen was Osrith's plan, she smiled at Gisela, who was being followed by 2 maids, close behind both children. Gisela smiled in return at Osrith's pleasantry, and it took a couple of heartbeats until the little party had rounded the next corner, for Osrith to climb the nearest roof, much to the annoyance of a butcher plying his trade from the front of his shop, and trod softly across the eastern row of shops until she watched them, too, disappear in the direction of Crapelgate. Well, they were Danish pagans, after all, Osrith thought, scrambling down to street level and strode towards the palace, and hadn't Beether on the beach at Doyle explained that the Danish beliefs and those of the Britons were far more similar to one another than ever Christian belief was to either. Unfortunately, Osrith was needed with Edward, who had been instructed to practice his sword skill, and so they headed out into the courtyard, Edward holding his blade high, as Osrith had taught him. Though he may have many other half-brothers, it was strange, Osrith thought, that his elder brother was now Utard's newest warrior. "Tell me a story," Edward begged Osrith that night, when she thought he was just about to go to sleep. "Do you know any?" "I know many," Osrith sighed, wearily. "One of kings." "What can you tell me of kings where you come from?" "Kings where I come from," Osrith thought, and thought again of Domhnall and of Flansinna. "I read a story once that is very good," Osrith proposed. It had been in one of the Scriptotium books in the monastery at Doyle. It was of the first High King of Ireland, Neil Noiglark, the first Ui Neil, and proceeded to tell of Neil's birth and abandonment and winning the throne of Tara. Edward listened in fascination, especially when Osrith mentioned Neil's mother was a Saxon. "He is of the 9 hostages," Osrith concluded sleepily, as the Etheling wanted to know more. "All of the kingdoms of Irion, they say, and Alba and Wales, and the Heptarchy, through his mother." "So the kings of Ireland have Saxon blood?" "So legend has it," Osrith replied. "And you read that story?" Edward pressed. "You can read." "Read ... right," Osrith mused, thinking of the man who had taught her, Bicca. Perhaps, quite soon, she should approach him, and tell him she was alive. Once the Etheling was asleep, Osrith left Edward's room, nodding to one of Steeper's men to watch the door as she went. Of all places, to the palace's chapel. Perhaps the night would be tonight, Osrith thought, as she thought about Bibbenberg, and his patience and kindliness towards her. Because, Osrith thought, he was often there at night, holding the vigil service. She had gone and sat and listened many times and heard him preach often. As August gave way to September, Osrith felt like she had spent more time in the chapel than God himself, but had never brought herself to talk to him. What would she say? What could she say that would leave her life as it is now? He would argue she was someone's responsibility. Osrith was sure of that, and she had gone those times more for paternal comfort than confiding in him, and they had watched his wife, Thyra, long hair, angular face, eyes like the North Sea in the summer, palest blue, bright and full of life, as she watched Pekka. No one was in the chapel now, and Osrith sat, and thought of her life, and what to do next. Should she tell him? It felt right to do so, rather than her brother. Osrith was beginning to conclude. Utad's connection, his only connection, to Bibbenberg was conquest. Nothing else mattered to him. His life was utterly unconnected to her own. If he came, tonight, into the chapel, to pray, Osrith thought, as she sat silently, still, she would kneel beside him. She would tell him the joy at sharing her secret with her former teacher and priest. Her father in more than one sense when she was a child became hopefulness, became jumpiness whenever the door of the chapel creaked.